I am a woman of shadows and silence, a maid in a house that does not know the true price of its peace. Every evening, as the sun dips below the horizon and the village of Makini grows still, a heavy weight settles upon my chest. My name is Adana, and for 3 years I have served the master of this great compound, keeping his floors polished and his secrets buried. But as the clock ticks toward the final hour, my heart begins a frantic dance. Just before the strike of midnight, when the master and his family are deep in their dreams, I quietly unbolt the heavy wooden door. The iron hinges groan like a dying man, a sound that makes my blood run cold in the night air. I slip out into the darkness, leaving the safety of the walls behind. As I cross the threshold, I hear a soft, pathetic whimper from the corner of the yard. It is the house dog, a beast that would normally tear a stranger to pieces. Tonight, he tucks his tail between his legs and crawls into the shadows, his eyes wide with a primal terror. He refuses to follow me into the blackness, for he senses what I know: something unseen is waiting. The morning light usually brings a sense of relief, but lately, the dawn has felt like a cruel trick. I returned to the house just as the first rooster called, my bones aching with a weariness that no sleep could ever cure. As I began my morning chores, a sharp cry pierced the quiet air of the nursery. I dropped my broom and rushed to the room, finding the mistress cradling her youngest child, little Kofi. My heart sank to my stomach when I saw him. The boy, who was usually full of laughter and mischief, lay limp in her arms. He was terrifyingly pale, his skin almost translucent, as if something had reached inside and drained the very life from his small veins. He looked weak, gasping for air like a fish pulled from the river. The mistress looked at me with eyes full of a mother's desperate fear and a growing sharp worry. She didn't say a word, but the air between us was thick with a silent question. This sudden, strange weakness only seems to happen after the nights I am forced to leave the compound. I bowed my head and continued my work, but I could feel the household beginning to notice the pattern. By the time the sun reached its peak, the tension in the kitchen was sharp enough to cut skin. The mistress finally cornered me near the large clay water jars, her face set in a mask of suspicion. "Adana," she began, her voice low and trembling with a mix of trust and doubt. "Where do you go when the moon is high? My husband says he hears the gate groan at midnight." I felt a cold sweat break out on my brow as I struggled to find words that were not lies but were not the full, dangerous truth. "I have a duty, mistress," I answered vaguely, my voice barely a whisper. "There are things in this world that require a debt to be paid in the dark." I could see the confusion in her eyes, a battle between the love she had for me as a faithful servant and the fear she had for her children. I hinted at the hidden cost I was bearing, but I offered no clear proof of my mission. She wanted an explanation, a reason to trust me again, but the rules of my burden forbade me from speaking clearly. I turned away, leaving her with more questions than answers. The pattern tightened like a noose around my neck as the week progressed. Despite the mistress's warning, the midnight hour called to me with a voice I could not ignore. I left the compound again, walking into the biting chill of the night to meet the unseen force that demanded my presence. When I returned and the sun rose over the village, I found the household in a state of high anxiety. In the center of the main hall, a prized clay pot, an heirloom passed down through the master's lineage for 3 generations, lay shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. It had been sitting safely on a high shelf, far from the reach of any child or animal. The damage appeared purposeful, as if an invisible hand had swept it aside in a fit of cold rage. No one had seen it happen, and no one had heard the crash during the night. I felt the weight of every eye in the room burning into my back. Could it be her fault? I heard a younger servant whisper from the shadows of the hallway. Suspicion was rising like a flood, and I was the only one standing in its path. The whispers turned into action on the 5th night. A younger servant named Ife, driven by a toxic mix of curiosity and deep envy, decided to follow me into the blackness. She thought she would catch me in a secret affair or find proof that I was stealing the family's wealth. I walked deep into the thick woods at the edge of the village, my feet knowing the path even in the dark. I reached a small clearing and knelt silently upon the cold, damp earth. I felt the presence of the unseen figure before me, a cold wind that smelled of ancient dust and forgotten graves. I began to converse in the language of the spirits, my lips moving but no human words reaching the air. Ife watched from behind a thick mahogany tree, her breath catching in her throat. She saw me bowing to nothingness, but she could feel the power vibrating in the ground. When I finally rose to return, Ife stepped forward to confront me, but she gasped in horror. The muddy ground where I had been kneeling was perfectly smooth. My footprints had vanished as if I had never touched the earth. I knew that Ife would spread her tales, so I hurried to do what I could to protect the innocent. While the household was distracted by the broken pottery and the gossip, I slipped into little Kofi's room. The boy was fading, his spirit flickering like a candle in a drafty room. I reached into the hidden folds of my apron and pulled out a bundle of sacred herbs I had gathered during my nightly walks. I crushed them between my palms, the scent of bitter earth filling the small nursery. With a heart full of desperate love and compassion, I rubbed the green paste over his forehead, whispering ancient prayers of healing. For a moment it seemed my secret sacrifice was working. His color returned, and he gripped my finger with a small, warm hand. I felt a surge of relief wash over me, believing I had finally outrun the debt. But the relief was only a temporary ghost. By the next morning, the boy had weakened again, his fever returning with a vengeance that stole the breath from his lungs. My healing was a bandage on a wound that was too deep for herbs alone. The seeds of rumor I had feared began to sprout into a forest of hate. Ife had told everyone what she saw in the woods, the vanishing footprints, the silent conversation with the air, and the way I knelt to the darkness. The other servants began to gossip openly in the courtyard, their voices reaching me like the buzzing of angry hornets. "She meets the night spirits," they hissed, crossing their arms over their chests. "She is stealing the life from the children to keep herself young." I saw the way the village women pulled their children away from me when I went to the market for supplies. The social pressure was becoming a physical weight, a mountain of suspicion that threatened to crush the master's house. The mistress, who had once treated me like a sister, overheard these whispers while she was tending to her dying garden. I saw the look of pure doubt in her eyes as she watched me from the window. She was no longer just worried. She was beginning to believe that the woman who cooked her meals was the same woman who was poisoning her life. The first true confrontation happened in the cold light of the kitchen. The mistress walked in, her face pale and her hands trembling. "You must stop leaving at night, Adana," she commanded, her voice cracking with the strain of her fear. "I will bolt the gate from the outside if I have to. You are bringing a darkness into this home that we cannot fight." I dropped the knife I was using to peel vegetables, the metal clanging loudly against the stone floor. I looked at her, my eyes pleading for a trust that was no longer there. "Mistress, I beg of you, do not forbid me," I cried urgently. "If I stop going, the cost will be far worse than anything you have seen. My absence is the only thing keeping the debt at bay." I saw the confusion in her eyes deepen into a sharp anxiety. I was speaking of hidden stakes she could not understand, implying that the broken pots and the child's fever were only the beginning. But to her, my words sounded like the threats of a witch. The audience of servants gathered at the door, their faces hard and unforgiving. That night, I ignored the mistress's warning, for the pull of the midnight debt was stronger than my fear of her anger. I returned from the woods just as the moon was beginning to fade, but I felt a heavy presence following closely behind me. It was not a person, but a thick, pulsating shadow that seemed to cling to the hem of my skirt. I reached the gate and slipped inside, but the shadow did not vanish. It lingered near the heavy iron bars, a patch of darkness that was blacker than the night itself. I felt a cold chill of foreboding as I watched it move. The next morning, one of the older children pointed at the gate and began to scream in a high, piercing tone. The shadow was still there, a shimmering void in the bright morning sun. It did not disappear when the master threw salt at it or when the village priest sprinkled holy water. It stayed there, a silent sentinel of the debt I had failed to fully pay. The household was paralyzed by a new, deep fear. The shadow was proof that I was bringing something terrible back with me. The master and mistress reached a wrong and dangerous conclusion that evening. They sat in the grand hall, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of many candles, and made a plan to expel me from the compound. "She is a magnet for the dark things," the master declared, his voice full of a misplaced blame. "Ever since she started her nightly walks, our son has sickened and our peace has fled. We must cast her out before the shadow enters the house." I stood in the darkened hallway, overhearing their plan, my heart shattering like the clay pot. They didn't understand that the shadow was only at the gate because I was there to hold it back. Silence filled the room as they finished their deliberations, a heavy, suffocating silence that felt like the end of the world. I realized that if I were sent away, there would be no one to walk into the night, and the force at the gate would finally find its way inside. I had to find a way to make them understand, but the evidence was stacked against me in a mountain of lies. I stepped out from the shadows and fell to my knees before the master, my voice a desperate plea for a bargain I knew would cost me everything. "Master, I beg you for one last night," I cried, my tears wetting the polished floor. "If you expel me now, you are opening the door to a hunger you cannot imagine. Give me tonight to protect this house. If I fail, I will walk away and never return." The master looked at me with a cold, calculating eye, while the mistress clutched her sick child tighter. "And if another child falls ill," he asked, "what then?" I took a deep breath, the stakes deepening with every word. "If anything goes wrong, I will take the full measure of the pain myself," I promised. "I will offer my own life to the debt to spare yours." They agreed, but only because they were too afraid to do anything else. I knew that the next few hours would decide the fate of everyone in the compound. I prepared myself for a battle I wasn't sure I could win, feeling the weight of the generational debt pressing down on my very soul. Midnight arrived, and I slipped out of the gate for the final time as a servant of the house. Unknown to me, the master's eldest nephew, a boy with a brave but foolish heart, followed me into the woods. He hid in the tall grass as I reached the sacred clearing and knelt before the glowing ethereal figure that appeared among the trees. The figure was a shimmering orb of pale blue light, its voice a low hum that sounded like 1,000 bees. The boy watched in awe as the figure spoke, but he could only hear a rhythmic vibration. Only I could understand the words. "The debt is hungry, Adana," the figure whispered. "The blood of the ancestors demands a payment that your herbs cannot provide." I responded in the ancient tongue, my voice full of a defiant strength. "I am here," I told the light. "Take from me, but leave the children alone." The nephew watched, his mind racing with questions. Was this figure an ally or a mortal danger? He saw me glowing with the same blue light, my body trembling under the strain of the energy transfer. When the sun rose on the morning of the 13th day, the household suffered a loss far more serious than a broken pot. I returned to find the master's prized cattle dead in the fields, their bodies unmarked but cold as ice. The vibrant garden that had been the mistress's pride was entirely wilted, the flowers turned to black ash overnight. Worst of all, the very walls of the grand house began to tremble, fine cracks spider-webbing across the plaster as if an earthquake were centered directly beneath the foundation. A rising dread filled the air, mixed with a sharp sense of guilt and fear. I collapsed near the well, my skin gray and my eyes sunken. I was losing my strength. The debt was growing too heavy for a single person to bear. What if it consumes me next? I whispered to the wind, my heart failing. I realized that the force was no longer satisfied with the small payments I was making. It wanted the life of the house itself. I was failing as a shield, and the consequences were becoming visible for all the village to see. In their desperation, the household sent for the village elder, a man who was said to remember the names of the trees and the language of the stones. He arrived at the gate, his eyes fixing immediately on the shadow that still lingered there. He walked through the house, touching the cracked walls and the dead plants, his face a mask of solemn wisdom. Finally, He sat in the main hall and called the master and mistress to him. "You are being haunted by a hunger," he began, his voice a low rumble. "But it is not a curse brought by a stranger. It is a debt that was passed down through your own blood, from the time of your great-grandfather." The master looked shocked, his face pale with a sudden dawning realization. "Who has been paying this debt for you?" the elder asked, his gaze shifting toward the kitchen where I stood. The household fell silent as they realized there might be a hidden cost to their prosperity that they had never seen or acknowledged. They had lived in comfort while someone else had been walking into the night to pay their bill. The elder began to clarify the rules of the supernatural struggle, his words increasing the moral stakes for everyone in the room. "The protection of a lineage is not free," he explained, looking at the cracks in the walls. "It requires a willing soul to walk into the night and bear the unseen consequences. Every blessing your family has enjoyed for 3 decades was paid for by a sacrifice." All eyes turned to me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of shame in the mistress's eyes. They realized that my nightly walks weren't an act of betrayal, but an act of extreme devotion. However, the elder's words also held a warning. "The debt has grown too large for a servant to carry alone," he said. "The origin of the debt is in the blood of the master, and the night spirits are tired of substitutes." A half-revealed truth was hanging in the air. I was the one who had been shielding them, but the shield was about to break. The moral complexity of the situation weighed heavily on the master, who had enjoyed wealth while I had suffered the nightly cold and the draining of my spirit. As the news of the nightly disturbances and the dead cattle spread, the village leaders grew restless. They did not understand the nature of the debt. They only saw a house that was falling apart and a maid who was at the center of the chaos. They feared that the curse would spread to their own homes and ruin their own harvests. A group of men led by the village headman arrived at the compound, demanding that I be punished or banished permanently. "We will not have a witch among us," they shouted from the gates. The master, pressured by his peers and afraid of losing his standing in the community, felt his hand being forced. A public gathering was announced for the following day to judge my actions and decide my fate. I felt the judgment day approaching like a dark storm on the horizon. I was a woman alone against an entire village, and the only proof of my innocence was a debt that no one wanted to admit existed. I looked at the master, hoping for a defense, but he looked away, his cowardice winning over his gratitude. The village leaders ordered that I be chained inside a small room in the back of the house, forbidding me from leaving for my nightly walk. "If she stays inside, the spirits will leave with her," they reasoned. I begged and pleaded, my voice hoarse from screaming. "You are killing yourselves," I cried as they turned the key in the lock. That night, the house did not just tremble. It shook violently, as if a giant were trying to tear it from the ground. The shadow at the gate didn't just linger. It flowed under the door like black ink, filling the halls with a freezing, unnatural mist. Dishes shattered in the cupboards, and the master's own bed was tossed across the room by unseen hands. This was the proof that my nightly trips had been the only thing shielding the household from a total collapse. Something terrible had finally arrived because there was no one in the woods to meet it and pay the toll. The injustice of my imprisonment was now clear, but the damage was already being done to the very foundation of their lives. The morning after my imprisonment, the compound was a scene of total devastation. The remaining livestock were gone, and the master's eldest daughter had fallen into a deep, unshakable sleep that no one could wake her from. The villagers who had demanded my chains stood at the gate, their faces pale with a new and terrible realization. I was released from my room, my body weak and my spirit exhausted, but I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The consequence of their ignorance was visible in every cracked stone and every weeping parent. The elder walked through the ruins, his staff clicking against the broken floor. "You mistook the shield for the curse," he said to the crowd, his voice full of a biting truth. "You punished the woman who was holding the door shut, and now the door is wide open." Without my nightly absence, the unseen forces had wreaked havoc on everything the family held dear. I was never the danger. I was the only thing that had made their perfect life possible. The social dynamic of the village shifted in an instant from judgment to a desperate, clawing fear. Despite the evidence, some of the villagers still looked for someone to blame, and their anger turned back toward me in a fit of panicked desperation. "She should have told us," they shouted. "She let us believe she was a witch." The household, caught between their guilt and their fear, struggled to find their voice. It was then that the elder stepped into the center of the square and raised his arms for silence. "You blame her for your own blindness," he asked the crowd. "She bore the pain so you could sleep. She took the shadows so you could have the sun." He declared that the time for secrets was over. The crowd began to demand proof of this debt, their envy and mistrust flaring up once again. They wanted to know why this family was chosen to bear such a cost and why a maid would volunteer to pay it. The tension peaked as the master was forced to stand before his neighbors and admit that his prosperity was built on a foundation of hidden sacrifice. The social dynamics of Makini were being rewritten by the truth, and the ink was the blood of the innocent. The elder began to reveal the true origin of the debt, a story that stretched back 50 years to the master's grandfather. It was a story of a promise made during a great famine, a bargain struck with the spirits of the land to ensure the family's survival and wealth. The grandfather had promised that every generation, a soul from the house would walk the night and pay the price in vitality to keep the land fertile and the children healthy. But the master's father had grown lazy and had stopped the ritual, leading to a mounting debt that was now demanding payment with interest. The household was bound by an ancestral promise that they had forgotten, but the spirits had not. I listened as the history was laid bare, my own role in the story finally beginning to make sense to the audience. I had been paying a generational debt that I had no part in creating. The tension shifted from a simple story of a witch to a complex moral drama about the costs of ancestral greed. The villagers watched in silence, their judgment replaced by a dawning awe at the complexity of the supernatural law. The most emotional revelation came when I was asked why I, a simple maid from a distant village, would take on such a terrible burden for a family that wasn't my own. I looked at the mistress, my eyes filling with tears. "I didn't do it for the master's gold," I told the crowd. "I did it because 3 years ago when I first arrived, the mistress's sister, the woman I loved like my own mother, was the one whose turn it was to pay the debt. She was old and dying, and she couldn't walk the woods anymore. I volunteered to take her place so she could die in peace." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The mistress's youngest brother, a man who had been saved from a childhood illness by that very sister, stepped forward. Guilt and admiration mixed on his face as he realized that his life had been bought by my nightly walks. I had sacrificed my own youth and health to save the people he loved. The tension in the square was no longer about blame. It was about the staggering weight of a selfless heart. I was no longer a servant. I was a guardian who had chosen her post out of love. The elder then presented the village with an impossible moral choice. "The debt is now fully revealed," he announced. "The spirits will no longer accept a secret payment. The debt can now be paid openly and permanently by a member of the bloodline stepping forward to complete the final ritual, or Adana can continue to bear it until it eventually consumes her life." A heavy silence fell over the village square, a silence so thick you could hear the beating of 100 hearts. All eyes moved from the elder to the master, then to his brother, and finally back to me. The supernatural threat was still pulsing in the air, a cold wind that refused to die down. The master looked at his hands, his face a battleground of fear and responsibility. No one wanted to walk into the blackness permanently. The choice returned to the family. Would they finally take up their own cross, or would they let the woman who had already given them 3 years of her life be the final sacrifice? I waited, my spirit weary but my resolve ready for whatever the night required. As the sun began to set on the day of decision, I prepared myself to walk into the forest one last time. I knew that the master was too afraid and the mistress too broken to take my place. I put on my dark cloak and picked up my staff, my heart heavy with a sense of finality. This would be the last walk. The spirits would take everything this time. I walked toward the gate, but I was stopped, not by the village guards or the master's chains, but by a loud, shaking confession from the back of the crowd. The master's brother, the man I had saved by taking his sister's burden, stepped into my path. "Enough!" he cried, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "She has paid for our sins for long enough. I was the one who was supposed to be the head of this house. I was the one who enjoyed the fruits of her suffering while I pretended not to see her tired eyes." He looked at me with a profound respect and a deep, cutting shame. He took the staff from my hand, his decision made. The emotional climax of the story had reached its peak. The brother walked into the sacred clearing as the entire village watched from the edge of the woods. He knelt where I had knelt, and he spoke the words of the final ritual with a voice that didn't tremble. The glowing figure appeared, but this time it did not take his life. It took his truth. The unseen force, satisfied by a voluntary sacrifice from the true bloodline, began to recede. The blue light flared one last time and then vanished into the earth. The shadow at the gate dissolved into nothingness, and the cracks in the house walls stopped growing. The public sacrifice had worked because it was rooted in honesty and a willingness to bear the family's own cost. Everyone in Makini realized the staggering truth. I was never the one harming the house. I was the only one who had been holding it together. They had misunderstood the cost of their own lives. The master fell to his knees in the dirt, weeping for the years of silence and the injustice he had allowed. The moral and public revelation was complete, and the village stood in a new, humbler light. Midnight passed in the village of Makini, but this time the gate did not groan. I sat on the porch of the grand house, no longer a maid but a respected guest. No one left the compound, and nothing came from the woods to haunt us. The house stood intact, the garden began to show the first green buds of a new life, and little Kofi woke up with a hunger for his breakfast. The supernatural threat had vanished, and I was finally free from the burden of the nightly walk. Justice was visible at last. As I looked out over the peaceful village, I thought about the 3 years I had spent in the shadows. We often live in comfort without ever asking who is paying the price for our peace. We look at the maids of the world and see only their service, never their sacrifice. The story of the gate that opens at midnight is a reminder that every blessing has a cost, and usually, it is being paid by someone we have chosen not to see. So I ask you, my friends, who pays the price for what you fail to see in your own life? And what is the true value of a sacrifice that never asks for a reward?